Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking some absolutely fascinating foundational notes surrounding the Indian Constitution's preamble. We are going to take a journey that starts right at the bedrock of constitutional law and travels all the way into the complex, real-world economic realities of modern India. It's essentially a story of how just a few words on a page can totally shape the destiny of a nation. So I want to start by posing a question directly to you. Can a constitution function without its soul? Because legally speaking, it's customary, not absolutely mandatory, for a written constitution to even have a preamble. Technically, the document could function just fine without one. And yet, the preamble is widely considered the very soul and the ultimate summary of the entire Indian Constitution. It is the lens through which literally everything else in the document is meant to be viewed. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The Constitution's soul. 2. The legal tug-of-war. 3. Amending the preamble. 4. Capitalism versus communism. 5. The Indian socialist synthesis. And finally, 6. Welfarism in modern times. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the Constitution's soul, a bird's eye view. Now, you might have heard the opening phrase of the preamble, "We the people." But that isn't just poetic language, you know? It's actually a profound, legally significant declaration. It establishes the absolute supremacy of the people of India. It basically declares that the Constitution is not some arbitrary rulebook forced upon them by an alien power. Instead, it was enacted by the Indians themselves through their representatives. They are the ultimate decision makers here. Building on that immense power, the preamble lays out the specific ideals and aspirations the people set for their brand new nation. Sovereignty, socialism, secularism, democracy, republic, justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, unity, and integrity. This is essentially the promised checklist for the entire nation's future. Moving right along to Section 2, the legal tug-of-war. Is it enforceable? But here is where we hit a massive historical hurdle. If the preamble is the soul and contains all these incredible aspirations, does it actually hold any weight in a court of law? Like, can you sue the government if one of these ideals isn't met? Historically, there was a major tug-of-war over this. Back in the 1960 Barubar Union case, the Supreme Court ruled that while the preamble is kind of a key to understanding the maker's minds, it wasn't actually a part of the Constitution itself, and therefore you couldn't enforce it in court. But fast forward to the modern view, cemented by the landmark 1973 case of Anand Bardi case and reaffirmed later in 1995, the Supreme Court totally reversed course. They declared that the preamble is an integral part of the Constitution. Now, while it's still not directly enforceable on its own to just strike down a law, it plays a massive, vital role in interpreting the rest of the document. It's the guiding light. But that raises another big question. How does a foundational text like this evolve? That brings us to Section 3. Amending the Preamble, the 42nd Amendment. The history of amending this specific document is actually remarkably sparse, which really tells you a lot about the reverence people hold for it. The original preamble was enacted on November 26, 1949, and since that very day, it has only been amended a single time, just once. That happened in 1976 through the 42nd Amendment Act. So what was so incredibly important that it required changing the very soul of the document? Well, 3 words were added: socialist, secular, and integrity. The phrase unity of the nation became unity and integrity. The nation also explicitly labeled itself as secular. But for the rest of this explainer, we're really going to zoom in on the most heavily debated concept of those 3 additions: socialist. Section 4. Capitalism versus communism. Understanding the spectrum. To truly grasp what socialist means in the Indian context, we kind of have to understand what it isn't. Let's look at capitalism. Capitalism is defined by individual ownership of the means of production and distribution. It's deeply rooted in the 17th century ideology of liberalism, which prioritizes individual freedom above all else. Think of Adam Smith's laissez-faire approach. It advocates for a minimal, almost police state whose only job is maintaining law and order, strictly not interfering in economic affairs. But as we saw during the Industrial Revolution, the total absence of labor laws and economic policies under this ideology led to visible, unchecked exploitation. Workers were doing incredibly long hours for minimal wages, basically generating surplus value solely for the wealthy elite. And it was this rampant economic inequality, this massive, exploding gap between the haves and the have-nots, that Karl Marx directly challenged. Marx theorized that workers would eventually reach a breaking point. They'd become fully conscious of their exploitation, and this would trigger a massive class struggle, a revolution. In this revolution, the capitalists would be defeated, capitalism would end, and socialism would be established, where the state steps in to own the means of production. But here's the thing. According to Marx, socialism is merely a transition phase. The ultimate endpoint is communism. He envisioned this as a completely classless, stateless society built on community ownership. Its guiding principle is pretty famous, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And actually, here's a really surprising historical footnote from our sources. Mahatma Gandhi, even though he came from a completely different philosophical framework, as a philosophical anarchist, he also favored the ultimate ideal of a stateless society. So this brilliantly illustrates the two extreme ends of the global spectrum. On one side, you've got capitalism, driven by individual ownership, protected by a minimal state, and hyper-focused on individual freedom. On the very opposite end, communism, driven by community ownership, envisioning absolutely no state at all, and focused purely on distributing resources according to people's needs. So, where exactly does India fit into this intense ideological battle? Let's look at Section 5, the Indian Socialist Synthesis, the Mixed Economy. India chose a very unique path, what we call democratic or Fabian socialism. Essentially, India completely rejected the Marxist idea that socialism requires some violent class struggle and revolution. Instead, the objective is to establish a welfare state, a socialistic pattern of society, but doing it entirely through democratic means. We're talking about using the ballot box and parliamentary laws to enact change peacefully. No revolution required. So what does that actually look like in practice? Well, we have some concrete historical examples. The state passed strict laws to abolish the exploitative zamindari land system. Later on, it enacted the nationalization of banks to ensure that capital wasn't just being hoarded by a tiny handful of people, but was actively directed toward broader social needs. The state definitely intervened in the economy, but they did it legally, democratically, and peacefully. Which brings us to our final section, Welfarism in Modern Times, the Era of Liberalization. Now, economies aren't static, right? In 1991, India underwent a massive shift, opening its markets up to the world. And a lot of people wondered, did the socialist ideal just die? There was this incredibly strong perception back then that the state's role would sharply decline and free markets would just completely dominate the landscape. However, the modern reality has proven to be quite different. The state absolutely hasn't vanished into a pure capitalist police state. Instead, it's adapted. It continues its vital welfarism directly alongside a booming private sector. And this adaptation is completely necessary because of specific modern challenges we've seen since liberalization. For instance, the open market created a lot of uneven development. Today, we see blue corridors. These are areas experiencing massive investment and rapid development, contrasted really starkly against red corridors, which are conflict areas heavily affected by Naxalism or unrest in places like Jammu and Kashmir or Manipur. So, to manage this incredibly complex landscape, the state leverages public-private partnerships, or the PPP model, blending state welfare goals with private efficiency. Furthermore, they actively enforce labor and consumer protection acts to prevent the exact kind of exploitation that Marx warned about all those centuries ago. So, the absolutely crucial point here is this. Welfarism is just as important right now as it was in the pre-liberalization era. Why? Well, because severe problems like poverty, hunger, disease, unemployment, and now massive environmental pollution, they all still exist. A purely free market simply does not automatically solve these issues. The state must continually step in, intervening to protect its citizens and fulfill those grand aspirations laid out in the preamble. Which leaves us with this final, truly provocative thought to ponder. As India continues to grow rapidly as a global market powerhouse, is true economic equality actually achievable in a liberalized system? How does a nation successfully balance the relentless demands of modern capitalism with the deeply held socialist soul of its founding constitution? It is an incredible balancing act, and it's one that continues to shape the daily lives of over 1 billion people today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.